On the afternoon of the 22nd of January, 1879, Lieutenant John Chard of the Royal Engineers was not preparing to become a hero. He was at Rorke's Drift, beside the Buffalo River in Natal, dealing with the kind of practical army work that almost never enters legend: ponts, wagons, stores, hospital patients, and a mission station being used as a supply post for Lord Chelmsford's invasion of Zululand. Less than 10 miles away, beneath the hill of Isandlwana, the main British camp was supposed to be secure. Then riders began coming in. The first reports sounded impossible. The camp at Isandlwana was gone. Men of the 24th Regiment had been cut down. The British column that had marched into Zululand with rifles, artillery, and imperial confidence had been smashed by the Zulu army in a single day. Chard had men from that same regiment at Rorke's Drift, many of them from B Company under Lieutenant Gonville Bromhead. Some were sick, some were wounded. Some were not even meant to be fighting men. And now a Zulu force of around 3,000 to 4,000 warriors under Prince Dabulamanzi kaMpande was moving towards them. The British had expected the war to prove the power of the empire. Instead, by late afternoon, a handful of soldiers were barricading a hospital and a storehouse with mealie bags and biscuit boxes, while the smoke of a British disaster still hung over the day. How did roughly 150 defenders survive the same army that had just helped destroy a British camp? The answer begins at Isandlwana, but it cannot stay there for long, because the men at Rorke's Drift did not experience Isandlwana as a chapter in a history book. They experienced it as a warning arriving too late. Lord Chelmsford's central column had crossed the Buffalo River into Zululand in January 1879, using Rorke's Drift as a crossing point, hospital, and supply depot. The camp at Isandlwana sat forward of that post, below a steep-sided hill whose shape became infamous by the end of the day. Chelmsford had taken part of his force away from the camp in the morning, leaving Lieutenant Colonel Henry Pauline in command. Colonel Anthony Durnford arrived later, but the camp remained dangerously exposed, without a proper laager of wagons or entrenched perimeter. The Zulu army that came against it was disciplined, fast and far better organized than many British officers had allowed themselves to believe. Its famous Horns of the Buffalo formation was not a theatrical phrase. It was a practical battlefield system. The chest fixed the enemy, the horns wrapped around the flanks, and the reserve waited to finish the work. Against a British camp whose firing line became stretched and whose control began to fail, that system became deadly. The soldiers at Isandlwana fought. That matters. The disaster was not caused by a lack of courage. Men of the 24th Regiment and other units stood their ground in places until ammunition, distance, pressure, and encirclement made survival impossible. Once the Zulu closed in, the British advantage in rifles could no longer decide the battle quickly enough. By the afternoon, the camp had been overwhelmed, and the news began traveling back towards the river through frightened riders, exhausted survivors, and men who had seen enough to know that the normal rules had broken. At Rorke's Drift, the reports landed among people who had almost no time to process them. Chard was the senior officer on the spot. Bromhead commanded the infantry detachment of B Company, 2nd Battalion, 24th Regiment. Acting Assistant Commissary James Langley Dalton, an older man with previous military experience, understood the practical danger of trying to retreat with sick and wounded men. Surgeon James Henry Reynolds still had patients in the hospital. Colour Sergeant Frank Bourne had to help keep order among men who knew that their own regiment had been mauled only a few miles away. The first real decision was simple to state and brutal to make. If they marched away, the wounded slowed them, the road exposed them, and the Zulu could catch them in the open. If they stayed, they would fight from buildings never designed as a fort, but at least they could choose the ground, shorten the approaches, and force the attackers to pay for each gap, wall, and doorway. Dalton strongly supported the decision to defend the station, and that advice mattered because it gave shape to what fear might otherwise have scattered. Rorke's Drift had once been a mission station associated with the Swedish missionary Otto Witt and named in English after James Rorke, an Irish trader who had worked the crossing. By January 1879, it had become a rear post of the invasion. The main buildings were the hospital and the storehouse, set apart enough that a continuous defense had to be built between them. Around the post were wagons, sacks of mealie meal, biscuit boxes, a cattle kraal, low walls, and the hill called Schiane, known to the British as the Oscarberg. None of those details were dramatic until the defenders started turning them into a plan. Men dragged mealie bags into lines. Biscuit boxes were stacked where gaps had to be closed. Wagons were pulled into position. The hospital and storehouse were connected into a rough perimeter. Each task had a direct purpose. A bag placed badly could leave a weak point. A gap left open could let one rush become a collapse. Ammunition had to be kept close enough to the firing line because a rifle without cartridges would become a club before the night was over. Before the first assault begins, write in the comments where you are watching from. This battle was fought beside the Buffalo River on the border of Natal and Zululand, but its story traveled far beyond that crossing, so tell us your city and country below. At about 4:30 in the afternoon, the lookout saw Zulu warriors approaching around the Oscarberg. The attackers belonged to the Undi Corps, including regiments such as the Isandlwana, Indlondlo, Udloko, and Indluyengwe. Many had not been heavily engaged in the main fighting at Isandlwana, but they arrived with the confidence of men who had seen a British camp fall that same day. Their commander, Prince Dabulamanzi kaMpande, King Cetshwayo's half-brother, had crossed towards Rorke's Drift with a force large enough to drown the little post if the defenders lost control for even a few minutes. Chard's defense now had to become real. The first Zulu attacks pressed against the south and west of the station, where the defenders used Martini Henry rifles to fire into the advancing warriors. At distance, British firepower was devastating, but the Zulu did not behave like men who expected to vanish at the sound of rifles. They used folds in the ground, the cover near the Oscarberg, walls, bushes, and broken approaches to get closer. Some fired from the hillside and surrounding cover. Their shooting was not as controlled as the British volleys, but it forced men to duck, shifted attention away from the barricades, and reminded the garrison that danger was not coming from one neat direction. The first stage of the fight showed Chard the key problem. The original perimeter was too large for the number of men he had. Holding every outer feature would spread the defenders thin, and a thin line against thousands was an invitation to be broken. He began contracting the defense, giving up exposed sections and pulling men towards a shorter line around the storehouse and inner barricades. This was not retreat in the sense of panic. It was a decision made under pressure by an engineer who understood that a smaller line could live longer. Bromhead's men had to make that decision work with rifles in their hands. The garrison could not afford uncontrolled firing. A man who shot too early gave himself 1 second of comfort and created a problem for the next assault. Fire had to be deliberate, fast enough to stop a rush and steady enough not to drain ammunition before darkness. Colour Sergeant Bourne helped keep the line disciplined, and his presence mattered because in a fight like this men need authority close enough to hear over gunfire. Orders from a senior officer shaped the battle, but sergeants keep fear from spreading along the barricade. The Zulu attacks continued with pressure rather than one single dramatic charge. They probed, shifted, fired, came close, fell back, and came again. That made the defense harder, because a repulse did not give the garrison safety. It only gave them the next problem. Every time the Zulu found dead ground or a blind spot, the British had to adjust. Every time the defenders moved ammunition or men to one threatened point, they risked weakening another. Rorke's drift was turning into a battle of small distances and fast corrections. The hospital soon became the most dangerous place in the station. It had to be included in the defense because men inside it could not simply be abandoned at the first alarm. Yet the building was badly suited to a close fight. It was divided into rooms, the exits were limited, and once the Zulu reached the walls, each room could become isolated from the next. A soldier behind an outdoor barricade might pull back when ordered. A wounded man lying in a hospital room could not. As evening closed in, the Zulu pushed hard against the hospital side. Warriors tried to force windows and doors, strike through loopholes, and fire into the rooms. The defenders inside were no longer fighting a clean perimeter battle. They were fighting from one room to another, with patients behind them and attackers pressing at the walls. Private Joseph Williams defended one of those rooms, but the Zulu broke in and he was killed along with several patients. In that moment, the hospital stopped being merely a weak point. It became a race between evacuation and collapse. Private Henry Hook and Private John Williams became central to that race. With normal exits exposed, they began breaking through internal walls to move patients from room to room. This is the part that must be understood step by step. First, a room came under pressure at the door or window. Then the defenders had to hold the attackers back long enough for someone to smash an opening through the wall. Then a patient had to be dragged, lifted, or pushed through the gap. Then the men had to do it again in the next room, knowing the room behind them might already be lost. There was nothing tidy about this. The openings were crude. The patients were heavy, frightened, and sometimes wounded too badly to help themselves. Smoke filled the building as the thatched roof caught fire. The light from the flames made movement easier to see and harder to hide. Hook, John Williams, Robert Jones, and William Jones helped get men out under conditions where every delay had a cost. Some patients did not survive. Some defenders were cut off. Others escaped because someone stayed in danger long enough to move them. The hospital fight matters because it turns the battle from a story about numbers into a story about choices. The defenders might have saved themselves more easily by abandoning the men who could not move. Instead, several of them turned the building into a sequence of desperate rescue attempts, holding doors, breaking walls, dragging patients, and falling back only when the next room became impossible. This was not heroism as a slogan. It was a man deciding that another man's life was still his responsibility, even while the building burned. Outside the hospital, Chard's shortened perimeter had to absorb survivors without letting the whole position loosen. The loss of the hospital could have broken morale. Instead, the garrison made the line smaller again. The storehouse, mealie bag walls, and inner barricades became the core of the defense. The post was now tighter, more crowded, and more dangerous if breached, but it was also easier for the remaining defenders to cover with concentrated fire. If you value military history told through decisions, pressure, and the men forced to hold the line, subscribe to the channel. And before we move into the final hours of Rorke's drift, write where you are watching from, because this small post beside the Buffalo River became a story remembered across the world. The fight after the hospital was less cinematic than the burning rooms, but it was just as important. Battles are often remembered by their most dramatic scenes, while survival usually depends on repetition. The defenders had to keep cartridges moving, keep rifles firing, keep wounded men from blocking the line, and keep listening for the next rush in the darkness. They had already lost part of the post. The Zulu were still outside in strength. Nobody inside the barricades could know whether the next attack would be the one that finally broke through. Private Frederick Hitch and Corporal William Allen, both wounded, helped carry ammunition to the line. That detail sounds small until you imagine the alternative. A section of barricade under pressure, men firing as fast as they can aim, a box running low, warriors closing through the dark, and no cartridges arriving in time. At Rorke's Drift, carrying ammunition while wounded was not a support task behind the battle. It was part of the battle. Surgeon Reynolds kept working among the wounded while the station remained under attack. Dalton, wounded during the fighting, continued to contribute to the defense. Bourne and the other non-commissioned officers helped hold together the practical rhythm of the line. Chard and Bromhead made the broader decisions, but the survival of the post depended on dozens of smaller actions. A man shifting to a threatened point, a rifle reloaded without panic, a box moved at the right moment, a command repeated clearly enough for tired men to obey. The Zulu continued testing the post through the night. Their courage deserves to be kept in the frame. They were attacking a defended position under concentrated rifle fire after a day of movement and violence, and they kept pressing because they believed the station could still be taken. The British stand becomes more impressive, not less, when the enemy is treated as formidable. Rorke's Drift was not a victory over weakness. It was survival against men who had already proved at Isandlwana that they could destroy a British force in the field. As the hours passed, exhaustion became its own threat. At the start of a battle, fear can sharpen men. Later, after smoke, thirst, wounds, and noise, the body begins to slow. Hands stiffen from loading, eyes strain into the dark. Every pause tempts a man to believe the attack is over, and every movement outside the barricade punishes him for believing it too soon. The defenders had to remain ready while being physically used up. By the early hours of the 23rd of January, the attacks began to lose intensity, but no one at the post could safely call that victory. The Zulu remained close, and a final rush against exhausted men might still have succeeded. When daylight came, the station looked less like a triumph than a wrecked workplace of survival. The hospital had burned. The barricades were damaged. Dead lay around the approaches. The defenders were alive, but they were not yet sure they were finished with the battle. Then the Zulu appeared again on the heights. For men who had spent the night fighting, that sight must have been brutal. They prepared for another assault because no officer could gamble the post on hope. But the Zulu did not renew the attack. They had suffered heavily. They had marched and fought through an extraordinary period, and British forces were now moving in the region. Eventually, they withdrew, leaving Chard, Bromhead, and the surviving defenders still holding Rorke's Drift. Afterwards, the defense became one of the most famous actions in British military history. 11 Victoria Crosses were awarded for Rorke's Drift, including to Chard, Bromhead, Dalton, Reynolds, Hook, John Williams, Robert Jones, William Jones, Hitch, Allen, and Corporal Christian Ferdinand Schiess. The number of awards helped fix the battle in public memory, especially because it followed so closely after the humiliation of Isandlwana. Britain needed a story of courage after a story of catastrophe, and Rorke's Drift gave it one. But the battle should not be reduced to a medal list or a patriotic painting. It did not erase the errors that helped produce Isandlwana. It did not prove that the invasion of Zululand had been wise. It did not make the Zulu army any less skilled, courageous, or dangerous. What it proved was narrower and stronger. When a small post was hit by a much larger force on the same day that British confidence had been shattered nearby, the men at Rorke's Drift kept making practical decisions under pressure until survival became possible. That is the real reason the story still works. Chard did not win because he had a perfect fortress. Bromhead did not hold because his men felt no fear. The defenders survived because they turned a depot into a fighting position, shortened the line before it snapped, rescued patients from a burning hospital, carried ammunition while wounded, and refused to let Isandlwana become the beginning of a second massacre. Sometimes courage is not a charge. Sometimes it is a barricade built in a hurry because running would kill the men who cannot walk. Sometimes it is a hole smashed through a hospital wall while the roof burns above you. Sometimes it is a wounded man carrying cartridges because the next volley depends on him. At Rorke's Drift, roughly 150 defenders survived against thousands, not because the danger was exaggerated, but because the danger was real and they kept working inside it. If this story changed the way you see Rorke's Drift, subscribe to the channel, leave a like, and tell us in the comments which battle, regiment, or commander we should break down next.